The conference room smelled like fresh coffee and old money, and I remember thinking that was exactly the kind of detail my brother-in-law would have planned. He always cared about atmosphere. My wife sat across the table in a charcoal blazer I had never seen before. Probably new, probably charged to the joint account 3 weeks before she filed. Beside her, her attorney had already arranged a stack of folders in a neat row, each one tabbed and color-coded, the kind of preparation that takes months, not weeks. Behind her, her mother leaned toward her father and whispered something. Her father almost smiled. Her brother Garrett sat slightly apart from the rest, arms folded, watching me the way people watch a game they already know the outcome of. My wife wanted the house, the investment accounts, the full ownership stake in the HVAC contracting business I had spent 11 years growing from a single van and a second-hand refrigerant gauge into a 22-employee operation with contracts across 3 counties. She wanted primary custody of our son and our daughter, citing what her attorney carefully described as my pattern of emotional unavailability. I sat with my hands flat on the table and listened to every word. Then my older brother Nathan, who had driven 4 hours from Columbus to sit beside me that morning, leaned close and spoke quietly enough that no one else could hear. "Let her take it," he said. I turned and looked at him. He had the same expression he'd had when we were kids, and he'd already figured out the answer to something I was still working through. "All of it," I said. "Trust me," he said. "All of it." Across the table, Garrett was already pulling out his phone. The room felt like a victory party they had forgotten to wait until after to start. What none of them understood was that the party was premature by about 14 months. And by the time they figured that out, I would be somewhere else entirely, watching my kids chase fireflies in a backyard that was actually mine. My name is Owen Calloway. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the second of 3 boys, raised by a father who fixed things for a living, and a mother who taught 4th grade and believed firmly that the only people worth trusting were the ones who showed up when it was inconvenient. I was never the loudest person in a room. I learned early that listening was more useful than talking, that patience looked like passivity to people who mistook stillness for weakness. It served me fine until I married into a family that read stillness as an invitation. I met my wife, Lindsay, when I was 29. She was warm then, or maybe I was just seeing what I wanted to see. We got married in a backyard ceremony in her parents' place in suburban Cincinnati, and I remember her father shaking my hand and telling me I seemed like a solid young man. He said it the way people say something tastes fine when they mean it tastes nothing at all. Her family had money, old and comfortable money, from her grandfather's commercial real estate holdings. Nothing obscene, but enough to mean that Lindsay had grown up with a certain understanding of how the world arranged itself. She understood there were people who built things and people who owned things, and she had been raised to be the second kind. I hadn't understood that fully when we married. I understood it completely by the time our son, Caleb, started kindergarten. The business had grown faster than either of us expected. We'd started in the 3rd year of our marriage with a $40,000 SBA loan, a used transit van, and a business license I pulled myself off the Ohio Secretary of State website. Lindsay had been supportive in the way people are supportive when they're not sure yet whether something will work. Once it started working, the nature of her support changed. She began referring to the company in ways that implied co-authorship she hadn't earned. At her family's Thanksgiving table, she talked about our decision to expand into commercial contracts, as if she had been part of that conversation, which had actually happened at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night while she was asleep, between me and my operations manager, over a legal pad and 2 cold cups of coffee. I didn't correct her. The business was growing. My kids were healthy. Some things didn't need to be argued. Her family was something I learned to navigate the way you learn to navigate a house with low door frames. After a while, you just duck automatically and don't think about it. Her father had a habit of asking me questions about the business in a tone that suggested he already knew better answers. Her brother, Garrett, worked in commercial insurance and had strong opinions about everything. He had a way of making jokes at my expense that came wrapped in enough plausible deniability that calling him on it felt like overreacting. Her mother was polite in the precise and calibrated way that communicates, without ever saying it, that you are a guest in a space that was never really meant for you. I watched Lindsay in those environments and noticed, over time, that she stopped inserting herself between me and her family's low-grade condescension. At some point, she simply moved to their side of it. I can't identify the exact moment it happened. I just know there was a version of our marriage where we were partners. And then there was a version where I came home to a house that felt like it had rearranged itself around an absence that was shaped like me. The moment everything became undeniable was a Saturday in April, 8 months before she filed. I had taken the kids to their soccer games and dropped them at her mother's afterward, which was the normal Saturday arrangement. I came home earlier than expected because Caleb had left his inhaler on the kitchen counter, and the forecast showed weather coming in. The house was quiet when I came through the side door. I walked toward the kitchen and heard voices coming from the living room. Lindsay was on a video call. I could see the screen reflection in the glass of the back door from where I stood in the hallway. A man I recognized. He ran a regional HVAC supply company whose territory overlapped with mine. Someone I had met twice at trade events and dismissed as a backslapper with a leased BMW was on the call. He was talking to my wife with familiarity of someone who had been talking to her for a long time. I would have walked away assuming nothing if I hadn't heard my name. I stopped. The conversation was about the business, not in a general way, in a specific way. He knew the names of two of my largest commercial accounts. He knew the general terms of a service agreement I had signed 4 months earlier that I had not discussed with anyone outside my office. He mentioned, casually, that once things settled, there would be opportunities to absorb some of my client base into his distribution network. Then Lindsay said something that I have turned over many times since. She said, "He won't fight hard, he never does. He'll act hurt and then he'll find something to fix and disappear into it." He laughed. She laughed. I stood in the hallway of my own house for another 30 seconds. Then I went back out the side door, sat in my truck, and drove around for an hour before I picked up the kids. I never mentioned what I had heard. Not to Lindsay, not to anyone, not for weeks. I have been asked since why I didn't confront her immediately, and the honest answer is this. Confrontation would have been the emotional response, and I had learned by then that the emotional response was almost never the useful one. What I did instead was call my brother. Nathan is 6 years older than me, and spent 20 years in logistics management before pivoting into business consulting. He understands how value actually moves through a company. More importantly, he understands how people behave when they believe they have already won. He listened to everything I told him and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Don't touch anything, don't move anything, don't change anything, and call a lawyer tomorrow morning." I called a lawyer. Then I called a forensic accountant. Then I called a second lawyer, one who specialized specifically in business valuation disputes and divorce proceedings, which is a more specific specialty than most people know exists until they need it. What the forensic accountant found over the following 3 months was not what I expected. Lindsay hadn't been transferring money out, nothing that obvious. What she had been doing, apparently with the assistance of the man on that video call, was something more subtle. She had been sharing operational information, client renewal schedules, pricing structures, the terms of 2 pending bids, with someone positioned to benefit from it. 2 of my bids had come in second to competitors whose numbers were suspiciously close to mine. None of it was provable in a way that would necessarily hold up as corporate espionage. All of it was documentable, in a way that would hold up in a divorce, proceeding as evidence of deliberate financial harm to a marital asset. While the accountant was working, I was doing something else. I had been meaning for 2 years to restructure the business, separate the operating entity from the holding company that owned the equipment and the commercial vehicle fleet, formalize some intellectual property protections around our service protocols and proprietary maintenance software. My business attorney had recommended it. I had kept putting it off. I stopped putting it off. Over 4 months working quietly and entirely within legal boundaries, we completed a restructuring that had been overdue anyway. By the time Lindsay filed, her claim was against a different entity than the one she believed she was claiming. I also did something else during those months. I showed up. Caleb had a science fair in November. I was there. My daughter, Ellie, had a dance recital in December. I sat in the front row. I drove them to school, helped with homework, showed up to every teacher conference, and saved every receipt, every email confirmation, every photograph. I was not doing it for the documentation, though the documentation proved useful. I was doing it because they were my kids, and the thought of losing time with them was the only part of any of this that actually frightened me. Lindsay grew more confident as the filing date approached. I noticed it in small ways. The way she moved through the house, the loosening of the careful neutrality she had been maintaining around the kids. She believed she had thought of everything. The more certain she became, the less careful she was. By the time we walked into that conference room, I had spent 11 months preparing for a meeting she thought she had already won. When Nathan told me to let her take it, he wasn't speaking without information. We had talked the night before for 2 hours. He had reviewed everything with me. He knew exactly what Lindsay's attorney was expecting, which was resistance, anger, negotiation, drawn-out litigation that would cost both sides money and time. and would put the business value front and center in discovery, which was precisely where I did not want this to go. What happened instead was that I agreed, quickly and without visible distress, to terms that looked extraordinarily generous. The house, a 4-bedroom colonial in a suburb of Cincinnati that carried a $300 to $400 monthly mortgage and had needed a new roof for 2 years, went to Lindsay. A lake house her family had helped us purchase, which had appreciated beautifully on paper and cost a small fortune annually in taxes, insurance, and upkeep, went to Lindsay. 2 vehicle leases in both our names transferred to her. I took my work truck. Her attorney paused twice to confirm he had understood correctly. Garrett, in the hallway afterward, clapped a friend of his on the shoulder and said something that made them both laugh. Her mother touched Lindsay's arm and squeezed it. The whole scene had the warm, loose energy of people who have just gotten exactly what they wanted. What they wanted turned out to be complicated to hold. The house's deferred maintenance became immediate in the first winter. The roof that had needed replacing for 2 years started failing in February. The HVAC system, and I am aware of the irony, required a full replacement that spring. The lake house's property tax assessment came in significantly higher than the previous year, and the insurance carrier Lindsay had inherited the policy, with sent a non-renewal notice in March. Finding comparable coverage for a property with its age and location took 3 weeks and cost 40% more annually. Meanwhile, the restructured business kept operating exactly as it had before, because from an operational standpoint, nothing had changed. The same employees, the same accounts, the same contracts. The legal structure had changed. The value Lindsay had been awarded was the value of an entity that no longer held the company's core assets. Her attorney figured it out within 60 days and sent a letter. My attorney responded. There were some uncomfortable conversations. There was no actionable fraud. The restructuring had been completed months before the filing, was reflected accurately in all disclosures, and had been recommended in writing by my business attorney, long before any divorce proceedings had begun. The man from the video call stopped returning her messages around the same time. His own company came under scrutiny for some procurement irregularities that had nothing directly to do with me, and everything to do with the way he operated generally. He was not a careful person. He had assumed, as careless people often do, that he would not be noticed. He was noticed. I remember the first time I saw Lee after the restructuring reality had fully settled on her. It was at a custody exchange in the parking lot of a grocery store. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The certainty she had carried through the entire divorce process was gone, replaced by something flat and careful. She didn't say anything about it. Neither did I. We transferred the kids' bags between cars and said what needed to be said about pickup times and the following weekend. I drove away and felt almost nothing. That surprised me. I had expected something, satisfaction maybe, or residual anger. What I actually felt was the specific lightness of a weight you have carried so long you had stopped noticing it until the moment it was gone. The kids adjusted better than I feared. Children are more perceptive than adults want them to be. And I think Caleb and Ellie had understood for some time that the version of our family they had been living inside was not quite real. What they needed was consistency, and I could give them that. I found a 3-bedroom rental in a neighborhood with a good school district and a backyard that backed up to a small creek. Caleb decided the creek was the best thing he had ever seen. Ellie asked if we could get a dog. We got a dog. Saturdays became our thing. Not organized, not scheduled, not the kind of quality time that comes with its own pressure to be meaningful. Just Saturdays. Farmers markets, hardware stores, drives with no destination. A running argument about which gas station makes the best hot dogs that has been ongoing for 2 years now and will never be resolved. Ellie started drawing. Caleb got into amateur radio, which is genuinely the nerdiest hobby a 13-year-old has ever chosen. And I love him for it unconditionally. The business kept growing. We landed a commercial contract with a regional hospital network in the second year after the divorce that represented more annual revenue than the entire company had generated in its first 4 years. I hired 5 more technicians. We moved into a larger shop. I stopped measuring my success by whether the people who had underestimated me had been forced to acknowledge their mistake. There was a version of me that wanted that. That version needed the acknowledgement to feel like it counted. I don't think about that version much anymore. Her family stopped bringing up the divorce at gatherings, which I heard about through mutual acquaintances, in that way that small city social networks work. The confident predictions they had made about my professional collapse had a short half-life. Garrett, I'm told, doesn't make jokes about me anymore. I can't say whether that's personal growth or just risk management on his part. Either way, it's not something I spend time on. What I've thought about more, in the years since, is why it took me as long as it did to understand what was happening. I had been trained by years of experience to interpret tolerance as maturity, and I had confused the two. There is a version of patience that is genuinely wise, holding back when the moment isn't right, letting things develop, not wasting energy on fights that don't matter. And then there is a version that is just fear of disruption dressed up as equanimity. For a long time, I was practicing the second one and calling it the first. The Saturday after the divorce was finalized, Nathan drove down from Columbus. We took the kids to a minor league baseball game, which is the correct American way to mark the end of difficult chapters. We ate terrible nachos. Caleb got a foul ball. Ellie fell asleep against Nathan's shoulder in the 7th inning. On the drive home, Nathan said, and I said yes, and I meant it in a way I hadn't meant that question in years. He nodded. That was it. My brother is not a man who requires resolution to be spoken aloud to be real. There's something I've come to understand about those words he whispered to me in that conference room. Let her take it. At the time they felt like strategy, and they were. But looking back, they were also something else. They were permission. Permission to stop gripping something that had already let go of me. The house wasn't mine anymore in the way that matters. The marriage wasn't mine anymore. Even the version of myself I had been protecting, the one that needed to win the argument, to prove the doubters wrong, to make the disrespect visible and costly. That version wasn't serving me. Letting go of all of it at once was the only way to find out what was actually mine. What was actually mine was already in the backseat of my truck, arguing about baseball and asking when we could stop for ice cream. I walked into that conference room expecting a fight for everything I had built. I walked out having given away the parts that were already broken and kept the only things that had ever been real. I don't tell this story to celebrate what happened to Lindsay or her family. Consequences aren't celebrations. What happened to them was the natural result of choices they made, and I was not the author of any of it. I was just a man who decided to stop losing himself in order to keep things that weren't worth keeping. If you're somewhere in the middle of what I went through, if you're sitting in a parking lot, or a spare bedroom, or a lawyer's waiting room, feeling like everything you built is about to be taken, I'm not going to tell you it goes fast, because it doesn't. I'm not going to tell you it doesn't cost anything, because it does. But I will tell you this. The thing you're most afraid of losing might not be the thing actually worth protecting. Figure out what's real. Hold on to that. Let the rest go.